Welcome back. If you were here for the first Atlantis video, you already know the origin story. You know about Plato sitting in Athens around 360 BCE, writing two dialogues that nobody asked for and everybody remembered. You know about the concentric rings and the golden temples and the mysterious metal called orichalcum that has never been found. You know about the Atlanteans, how they started virtuous and ended arrogant, how the gods ran out of patience and swallowed their island in a single day and night, and how that story escaped philosophy and became legend and then became something stranger and more persistent than either. You know all of that. Tonight we are not going back to the beginning. Tonight we are going somewhere the first video did not have time to take you. Tonight we are going looking, because here is the thing about Atlantis that the first video only touched the edges of. For all the mystics and the crystal enthusiasts and the ancient aliens episodes and the breathless YouTube rabbit holes, there are also serious people, archaeologists, geologists, oceanographers, classicists, who have spent significant portions of their careers asking a question that sounds simple and turns out to be anything but. What if there is something real underneath the story? Not the golden temples, not the divine bloodline, not the colossal statue of Poseidon with his head brushing the ceiling, but something, some kernel of actual historical event, some genuine catastrophe or genuine civilization that Plato's story is distantly, imperfectly, mythologically echoing. What if the legend is not just a parable, but a memory? That question has generated, over the past 2 centuries, some of the most obsessive and occasionally brilliant detective work in the history of archaeology. It has also generated some of the most spectacularly wrong theories ever published in a respectable journal, which is its own kind of fascinating. Tonight we are going to follow both threads, the credible and the questionable, the haunting and the absurd, and we are going to take them seriously in a way that neither dismissive skeptics nor credulous believers usually manage. Because the honest answer to the question of Atlantis is not, it was definitely real, and it is not, it was definitely fiction. The honest answer is considerably stranger and considerably more interesting than either of those positions, and it deserves to be told slowly in the dark, with enough time to let the details settle. Get comfortable. Dim the lights if you haven't already. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. There is something about knowing that someone in a quiet room somewhere in the world is lying in the dark, listening to a story about a lost civilization that never gets old. If you found your way here from part 1, welcome back and thank you for coming. If this is your first time on the channel, you do not need the first video to follow this one, though it will reward you if you go back to it. We make long, slow, deeply detailed historical journeys designed to take you somewhere genuinely fascinating and then put you gently to sleep. Subscribe to continue exploring the enigmatic corners of history that make the perfect companions for sleep. There is more waiting. There is always more waiting. Tonight we go looking for Atlantis, not the myth, the thing underneath the myth. And what we find along the way is going to surprise you. Chapter 1: The Real Candidates. There is a particular kind of afternoon light that falls on the caldera of Santorini in the late summer, a light that is simultaneously golden and slightly ominous, as if the sky remembers what happened here and has not entirely made its peace with it. The caldera is the flooded crater of one of the most violent volcanic eruptions in human history. A circular bay of extraordinary beauty ringed by cliffs of white and rust-red rock, the water inside it a deep, almost implausible blue, tourists photograph it from the cliff-top villages, eat dinner with their feet dangling over the edge of the ancient crater wall, and feel without quite being able to articulate why that they are looking at something that carries more weight than a pretty view should carry. They are right. They are looking at the grave of a civilization. They are looking at what remains of the island of Thera, which in the second millennium BCE was one of the most sophisticated, most beautiful, and most prosperous places in the ancient Mediterranean world, and which in a single cataclysmic eruption sometime around 1600 BCE was largely destroyed, its center collapsing into the sea, its population either killed or scattered, its extraordinary culture truncated at a moment of extraordinary flourishing. The Minoan civilization which had built the culture that Thera represented was not a minor or marginal phenomenon. It was, by any fair assessment, the first great civilization of Europe, predating classical Greece by over 1,000 years, predating Rome by considerably more. The Minoans built palace complexes of extraordinary sophistication at Knossos and Akrotiri and Phaistos, with running water and drainage systems and multi-story architecture and fresco painting of a quality that would not be matched in Europe for another millennium. They were a maritime trading culture of enormous reach, their pottery and their influence turning up across the entire Mediterranean basin, from Egypt to the Levant to the Greek mainland. And Thera, the island that the eruption destroyed, was one of their most prosperous outposts, a city of several thousand people with streets and squares and buildings several stories tall, with walls covered in frescoes of extraordinary beauty, showing fishing boats and spring flowers and young men boxing and blue monkeys climbing painted rocks, a world so vivid and so human that walking through the ruins at Akrotiri, where the ancient city has been excavated from beneath meters of volcanic ash, feels less like archaeology and more like trespass, like you have walked into someone's home at a moment they have merely stepped out of rather than abandoned 3,500 years ago. The parallels between the destruction of Thera and Plato's description of Atlantis are real, they are specific, and they are the reason that the Santorini hypothesis has been taken seriously by mainstream archaeologists in a way that most Atlantis theories have not. A sophisticated island civilization at the peak of its powers, destroyed by volcanic eruption and the tsunamis that followed, its center collapsing into the sea, leaving a circular body of water where an island had been. The eruption of Thera would have been visible and audible across an enormous area of the eastern Mediterranean. The tsunamis it generated devastated coastal settlements across the region. The ash cloud it produced would have darkened skies for months, affecting agriculture across the eastern Mediterranean and possibly contributing to the decline of several civilizations simultaneously, including the weakening of the Minoan civilization itself on the island of Crete. If you were an Egyptian priest in the 16th century BCE, watching the northern horizon light up with the eruption of Thera and then watching the sea withdraw and return as a wall of water, you would have experienced something that would have entered the collective memory of your civilization and persisted there for a very long time. Plato claimed that the Atlantis story came to Athens via Solon, who had heard it from Egyptian priests during his travels in the 6th century BCE. If that chain of transmission has any truth in it at all, even partial truth, even the truth of a genuine oral tradition rather than a specific conversation, then the Egyptian priests who spoke to Solon may have been drawing on a cultural memory of the Theran eruption that had been preserved and elaborated over 1,000 years of retelling. The timeline is imprecise but not impossible. 1,000 years of oral transmission distorts enormously which would explain why Plato's account differs from the Theran reality in significant ways, the direction being wrong, the size being wrong, the location being wrong. But the core image, a prosperous island civilization at the center of the Mediterranean world, destroyed suddenly and completely by geological catastrophe, sinking beneath the sea. That image could be a memory. It could be the oldest surviving account of a real event, encoded in myth and distorted by time, but pointing, however imperfectly, at something that actually happened. The problem with the Santorini hypothesis is the problem that afflicts every specific Atlantis theory, which is that the details do not quite line up when you press them hard enough. Plato places Atlantis in the Atlantic, beyond the Pillars of Heracles, which is to say beyond the Strait of Gibraltar. Thera is firmly in the Aegean, well inside the Mediterranean. Plato says Atlantis was larger than Libya and Asia combined, an island of continental proportions. Thera was a small volcanic island, significant in cultural terms but modest in physical scale, and the dates are wrong by about 9,000 years according to Plato's own chronology, which places the destruction of Atlantis at approximately 9,600 BCE, far too early for the Minoans, who did not develop their civilization until several thousand years later. Defenders of the Santorini hypothesis argue that Plato's dates are a mistranslation, that the Egyptian records counted in months rather than years, reducing 9,000 years to 900, which would bring the timeline within range of the Theran eruption. This is not impossible, but it is the kind of adjustment that requires you to distrust a significant portion of Plato's text in order to make the rest of it fit, which is a methodological position that makes historians uncomfortable. And yet the hypothesis will not die, and it will not die because the parallels are genuinely too striking to dismiss entirely. When archaeologists excavated Akrotiri, the buried Minoan city on Thera, they found something that deepened the mystery rather than resolving it. The city had been abandoned before the eruption. The inhabitants had left, taking their valuables and their animals, but leaving their buildings, their furniture, their painted walls. They knew the eruption was coming, perhaps from preliminary earthquakes, perhaps from changes in the volcanic activity they could feel through the ground, and they got out. Where did they go? What happened to them? They scattered into the Mediterranean world, the survivors of a civilization whose center had just been destroyed, and their stories traveled with them, changing as stories do, growing in the telling, accumulating detail and myth and the particular distortions that oral tradition imposes on memory over generations. Perhaps one version of that story eventually reached Egypt. Perhaps a version of the Egyptian version eventually reached Solon. Perhaps what we call the Atlantis myth is the shadow of that journey, faint and distorted and unrecognizable in its details but real in its origin. Perhaps the word that lives at the heart of every serious Atlantis discussion. Now let us cross the Atlantic, because Santorini is only the first and most academically respectable of the real candidates, and the story does not stop there. In the marshlands of southern Spain, in the Doñana National Park near the mouth of the Guadalquivir River, a team of researchers led by Richard Freund of the University of Hartford spent several years in the early 2000s arguing that the ruins of Atlantis were buried beneath the Spanish mud, detectable by satellite imagery and ground-penetrating radar, hidden in plain sight in a landscape of wetlands and salt marshes that was once, thousands of years ago, a coastal plain. Freund's team pointed to circular and rectangular patterns visible in the satellite images, patterns that they argued matched Plato's description of the concentric layout of Atlantis, and to geophysical evidence of ancient structures buried beneath the marsh surface. They also pointed to the geography, noting that the Spanish coast near the Guadalquivir estuary is one of the areas of the Atlantic world closest to the Strait of Gibraltar, which would place it in the general vicinity of Plato's Beyond the Pillars of Heracles. The Spanish hypothesis was received with skepticism by most mainstream archaeologists, who pointed out that the patterns visible in the satellite images were not obviously artificial, that the geophysical evidence was ambiguous, and that the identification of any specific site as Atlantis required a considerable amount of wishful interpretation. The researchers themselves were accused, not entirely unfairly, of working backward from a conclusion rather than forward from evidence, of finding what they were looking for because they had decided in advance where to look. Spanish archaeologists who knew the region well were particularly pointed in their criticism, noting that the area in question had been extensively studied for other reasons and that no evidence of a major Bronze Age civilization had been found. The documentary that accompanied the research, which aired on National Geographic in 2011, was widely criticized for presenting speculative conclusions with more certainty than the evidence warranted. And yet here is the thing that the critics sometimes glossed over in their understandable impatience with the overreach of the claims. The general region of southern Spain and the Atlantic coast of the Iberian Peninsula does contain genuinely puzzling archaeological evidence of sophisticated Bronze Age cultures that had extensive maritime trade networks and contacts with the wider Mediterranean world. The Tartessian culture, which flourished in this region in the first millennium BCE, was described by ancient sources as extraordinarily wealthy and sophisticated, with a capital city of legendary richness that has never been definitively located. Some historians have suggested that Tartessos, the lost city of Iberian legend, was the real-world inspiration for Plato's Atlantis, filtered through layers of Greek misunderstanding and philosophical elaboration. The candidate is imperfect, as all candidates are, but the cultural memory of a great and wealthy civilization somewhere in the western Atlantic world, preserved in ancient sources and distorted by time, is not something that can be entirely dismissed. Further out into the Atlantic, the Azores present their own version of the Atlantis argument, one that has been made in various forms since the 19th century. The Azores are a chain of volcanic islands rising from the mid-Atlantic ridge, the underwater mountain range that runs down the center of the Atlantic Ocean, and their geology has occasionally been invoked as evidence that the Atlantic basin once contained significantly more above-water terrain than it does today. The argument goes roughly as follows. If the mid-Atlantic ridge once had more volcanic islands or even a larger elevated plateau above sea level, and if some catastrophic geological event caused significant portions of that terrain to subside, then the general concept of a large landmass in the Atlantic that subsequently sank has at least some geological plausibility. The Azores themselves are the visible remnants of whatever that elevated terrain once was, mountain tops of a sunken landscape, exactly as Plato described when he said that after Atlantis sank, the sea in that region became impassable, full of shoals and mud. The geological argument is where mainstream science pushes back most firmly, and it is important to engage with the pushback honestly rather than dismissing it as closed-minded. The continental drift and plate tectonic processes that determine the configuration of land and sea operate on timescales of millions of years, not thousands. The kind of rapid, catastrophic subsidence that would be required to sink a continent-sized landmass in the Atlantic in a single day and night is not something that plate tectonics allows for. The ocean floor of the Atlantic has been mapped with considerable precision, and there is no evidence of a recently sunken continent. No geologically fresh escarpments or underwater cliff faces that would indicate rapid recent collapse. No sediment patterns consistent with the sudden inundation of a large land surface within the past 12,000 years. The geology is unambiguous on this point. There was no Atlantis-sized landmass in the Atlantic that sank during human prehistory. But here is the distinction that careful thinking about this topic requires us to make. The geological argument rules out Plato's specific description of Atlantis as a continent-sized island in the Atlantic that sank catastrophically. It does not rule out the possibility that Plato's story is a mythological elaboration of a real but much smaller event, a real but geographically mislocated event, a real event from a different ocean, or a genuine oral tradition about a historical catastrophe that has been overlaid with so much mythological elaboration that the original event is barely recognizable. The geology closes some doors. It does not close all of them. And in the space between the doors that are closed and the doors that remain open, the serious version of the Atlantis question continues to live. The most genuinely unsettling candidate, the one that serious researchers have returned to with increasing frequency in recent decades, is not in the Atlantic or the Mediterranean or the marshes of Spain. It is at the bottom of the ocean off the coast of India in the waters of the Gulf of Combat. In 2001, the National Institute of Ocean Technology of India announced that sonar surveys of the Gulf of Combat had revealed what appeared to be the remains of a large urban settlement on the seabed at a depth of approximately 40 meters. The structures detected by sonar were large, geometrically regular in ways inconsistent with natural formation, and spread across an area of several kilometers. Artifacts recovered from the site, including what appeared to be worked stone, pottery, and organic material, were sent for analysis. The organic material returned a radiocarbon date of approximately 9,500 years before the present, which would place the settlement's occupation, if the dating is correct, at a period before the end of the last ice age, at a time when sea levels were significantly lower than they are today, and the area now covered by the Gulf of Combat was dry land. 9,500 years ago. The date is haunting not because it matches Plato's chronology for Atlantis, though it does, with uncomfortable precision. It is haunting because it falls within the window of rapid sea level rise that followed the end of the last glacial maximum, a period during which global sea levels rose by approximately 120 meters as the great ice sheets of the northern hemisphere melted, flooding coastal and low-lying areas around the world and displacing whatever human populations had settled there. If the Gulf of Combat site is genuinely a submerged human settlement, and the evidence, while disputed, is not easily explained away, it represents a reminder that the world of 9,000 to 12,000 years ago contained human communities living in areas that are now underwater, communities whose settlements and whose stories were submerged by rising seas, and whose cultural memory of that submergence may have persisted in oral tradition for thousands of years before being written down. The flood myths that appear in virtually every ancient culture around the world, from the biblical flood to the Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh, to the flood myths of Hindu scripture, to the dozens of independent flood traditions recorded in indigenous cultures on every continent, are not all connected to Atlantis, but they may all be drawing from the same deep well of collective human memory, the memory of a world that was lost beneath the rising sea at the end of the Ice Age, a memory so ancient and so widespread that it encoded itself into the storytelling DNA of our entire species. That is the real candidate that deserves the most careful attention, not a specific island, not a specific location, but a specific geological period, the millennia between approximately 12,000 and 7,000 years ago, during which the world's coastlines changed dramatically and rapidly by geological standards, swallowing significant areas of previously inhabited land and displacing the communities that lived on them. If Atlantis is a memory of anything real, it is most likely a memory of that period, preserved and distorted and mythologized over thousands of years of retelling, until Plato received some version of it from Egyptian sources that had themselves been receiving and retelling versions of it for thousands of years before him. The specific details are wrong, the scale is wrong, the location is wrong, but the core of it, a sophisticated coastal civilization lost to a sudden and catastrophic inundation of the sea, may be the oldest surviving echo of something that genuinely happened, not once but many times, to many communities across the entire inhabited world. That is the first and most important thing to understand about the real candidates for Atlantis. None of them match Plato's description exactly, because Plato's description is not a geological report or an archaeological survey. It is a myth, and myths are not precise, but several of them point from different angles and with different degrees of credibility toward the same underlying truth, that the world our ancestors built in the millennia after the last ice age was partly submerged by rising seas, that the memory of that submergence persisted in human culture for thousands of years, and that what we call the Atlantis story is one version, filtered through Greek philosophy and Egyptian oral tradition and the particular distortions of a very long game of historical telephone of that memory. The candidates are imperfect, the evidence is incomplete, but the question, once you have spent time with the best of it, is harder to dismiss than it was before you started, and that, tonight, is enough to be going on with. Chapter 2. The Men Who Went Looking. There is a particular kind of obsession that the Atlantis mystery generates in certain kinds of minds, and it is worth pausing to understand what that obsession looks like from the inside before we examine the people who experienced it. It is not the casual fascination of someone who watches a documentary and thinks, interesting, before turning off the television and going to bed. It is something more consuming and more specific than that. It begins with the same hook that catches everyone, the sheer audacity of the claim, an entire civilization lost beneath the sea, and then it deepens into something that feels, to the person experiencing it, less like a hobby and more like a calling, the feeling that everyone else has missed something obvious, the feeling that the evidence is there, waiting to be assembled correctly, and that you are the person who can see how the pieces fit. The feeling that the answer is just one more book, one more expedition, one more calculation away. This feeling has driven some remarkable people to some remarkable lengths, and it has also, in several notable cases, driven otherwise sensible people completely off the edge of reason into territory that their colleagues found difficult to follow. Tonight, we are going to spend time with both kinds because both kinds are genuinely interesting and because the line between them is considerably blurrier than it appears from a comfortable distance. We begin with the man who is, in a very real sense, responsible for the modern Atlantis obsession in all its forms, the person who took Plato's philosophical footnote and turned it into a global phenomenon, whose book sold hundreds of thousands of copies and whose influence on everything that followed, the mystical versions and the scientific versions and the conspiratorial versions, is so pervasive that you cannot understand any of the later chapters of the Atlantis story without understanding him first. His name was Ignatius Donnelly, and he was, by any reasonable assessment, one of the more extraordinary figures of the 19th century, a man of such restless and generative intellectual energy that even his wrong ideas were interesting in a way that most people's right ideas never managed to be. Donnelly was born in Philadelphia in 1831, the son of Irish immigrants, and he made his first career in law and then in politics, serving as lieutenant governor of Minnesota at the age of 28, and then as a congressman for several terms, during which he developed a reputation as a passionate advocate for farmers and laborers and a tireless opponent of what he called the monopoly power of railroads and banks. He was a genuine populist in the original sense of the word, a man who believed with complete sincerity that the political and economic system of his time was rigged against ordinary people, and he spent much of his political career trying to do something about it. He was also, simultaneously, a man of voracious and undisciplined intellectual curiosity, who read everything he could get his hands on and who had a particular weakness for large, unifying theories that explained many things at once. This combination of populist instinct and appetite for grand explanatory frameworks would eventually produce a book that changed the world's relationship to the Atlantis story, though probably not in ways that would have entirely pleased him if he had been able to foresee them. Published in 1882, Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, was not a fringe publication or a self-published pamphlet. It was a serious, extensively researched, carefully argued book that was reviewed in major newspapers, praised by scholars in several fields, and eventually translated into numerous languages. Its central argument was straightforward and audacious. Atlantis was real. It had been located in the Atlantic Ocean, more or less, where Plato said it was, and it had been the original homeland of human civilization, the source from which agriculture, writing, metallurgy, astronomy, and virtually every other major cultural achievement had spread to the rest of the world. The pyramids of Egypt and the pyramids of Mesoamerica were not independent inventions, Donnelly argued, but evidence of a shared cultural origin, both descended from Atlantean civilization. The flood myths that appeared in so many independent ancient cultures were all memories of the same event, the catastrophic destruction of Atlantis. The alphabet, the calendar, the domestication of plants and animals, all of it traced back to this single source, this lost civilization in the Atlantic, whose destruction had scattered its survivors across the globe to become the founding figures of every subsequent civilization. It is a magnificent theory, and it is almost entirely wrong, which is one of the things that makes it so interesting as an intellectual artifact. The specific claims have been disproven one by archaeology over the past century and a half. The pyramids of Egypt and Mesoamerica are not evidence of a shared cultural origin. They are evidence that when you need to build a very large, stable structure and you have not invented the arch, a pyramid is the logical shape, independently derivable by any sufficiently motivated society. The flood myths do not all describe the same event. They describe a range of local and regional floods filtered through mythological elaboration over long periods of time. The alphabet and the calendar and agriculture all have well-documented independent origins in specific places at specific times that have nothing to do with a lost Atlantic civilization. Donnelly's framework in its specifics does not survive contact with the evidence, but Donnelly did something that had not been done before, something that was valuable regardless of whether his specific conclusions were correct. He took Plato's story seriously as a historical document rather than dismissing it as philosophy or engaging with it only as myth. He asked what it would look like if the story were grounded in actual events, and he gathered an enormous amount of comparative evidence from archaeology, geology, mythology, and linguistics to try to answer that question. He was working with the tools available to him in 1882, which were considerably cruder than the tools available to researchers today, and he was working within a theoretical framework, the idea of cultural diffusion from a single source that has since been substantially revised by the evidence of independent invention. But the impulse to take ancient myths seriously as potential carriers of historical memory, to look for the real events that might underlie legendary accounts, that impulse was not wrong. It was, in fact, considerably more sophisticated than the reflexive dismissal that characterized the response of many of his academic contemporaries, and it anticipated by several decades the serious scholarly work on myth and historical memory that would eventually establish, among other things, that Homer's Troy was real. Donnelly's book was a sensation, and its success spawned a century of Atlantis literature, some of it serious and some of it not, that Donnelly himself would not have recognized or endorsed. The specific figure who deserves the most attention in this lineage, the one whose influence has been most lasting and most strange, is not a researcher or an archaeologist, but a man who claimed to receive his information about Atlantis while lying in a trance state, a sleeping psychic from Kentucky named Edgar Casey, who was, in his own way, as remarkable a figure as Donnelly, and whose impact on the popular understanding of Atlantis has been, if anything, even more durable. Edgar Casey was born in 1877 in Hopkinsville, Kentucky, into a farming family with strong Baptist convictions, and he spent the first part of his adult life as a photographer and Sunday school teacher with no particular interest in ancient civilizations or esoteric philosophy. What he did have from an early age was an apparent ability to enter a self-induced trance state in which he would answer questions about medical conditions, offering diagnoses and treatment suggestions that his supporters claimed were often accurate and his detractors argued were vague enough to be unfalsifiable. He became known in his lifetime as the Sleeping Prophet, a man who could access information in his trance state that was unavailable to his waking consciousness, and he gave thousands of what he called readings over the course of his career, most of them focused on health and healing, but a significant number devoted to what he called life readings, accounts of the past lives of individuals who came to him for guidance. It was through these life readings that Atlantis entered Casey's work, and through Casey's work entered the mainstream of 20th century popular culture in a form that bears almost no resemblance to Plato's original account, but has proved in its own way even more tenacious. According to Casey's trance readings, Atlantis was a civilization of extraordinary technological sophistication, powered by a mysterious energy source he called the Tuaoi Stone, or the Great Crystal, a device of such power that its misuse had contributed to the series of catastrophes that eventually destroyed the civilization entirely. The Atlanteans, in Casey's telling, were not merely wealthy and arrogant Bronze Age seafarers who offended the gods. They were the possessors of technologies that exceeded our own, capable of harnessing energies that modern science has not yet rediscovered, engaged in a spiritual and technological conflict whose echoes were still being felt in the 20th century. Their destruction had not been a single event, but a series of 3 catastrophes spread over tens of thousands of years, with the final destruction coming around 10,500 BCE, scattering Atlantean survivors to Egypt, to Mesoamerica, to the Pyrenees, carrying with them the knowledge and the spiritual traditions of their lost civilization. Casey also made a specific and checkable prediction, one of the few in the Atlantis literature precise enough to be tested. He said that evidence of Atlantis would be found near the island of Bimini in the Bahamas, and that this evidence would emerge around 1968 or 1969. In 1968, a formation of large flat stones was discovered in shallow water off the coast of North Bimini by a pilot named Robert Brush, and subsequently investigated by diving researchers, including the French explorer Dmitry Rebikov. The formation, which became known as the Bimini Road, consists of a line of large, flat, regularly shaped limestone blocks extending for several hundred meters along the seafloor at a depth of approximately 5 meters, and it looks to a viewer disposed to see it remarkably like a paved road or wall. It looks to a viewer disposed to see something else, like a natural formation of beach rock, which is a type of limestone that forms in horizontal layers along beaches and can fracture along regular lines to produce flat, approximately rectangular blocks that superficially resemble worked stone. Geologists who have studied the formation in detail have concluded, with considerable confidence, that it is natural beach rock, its regularity a product of the natural fracture patterns of limestone rather than human workmanship. The blocks show no evidence of quarrying, no tool marks, no mortar, no foundation, nothing that would distinguish them from naturally formed beach rock except their arrangement, which is regular enough to inspire wonder, but not regular enough to require a human explanation. Casey supporters point out that the discovery fulfilled his prediction with remarkable precision, appearing almost exactly when and where he said it would. Skeptics point out that if you predict that evidence of Atlantis will be found in a specific region of shallow Caribbean water that has been frequented by divers and fishermen for centuries, and you predict it will be found within a 2-year window, you are making a prediction that is considerably less impressive than it sounds, because the Caribbean sea floor in the vicinity of the Bahamas is full of interesting-looking formations, and the late 1960s were a period of dramatically increased underwater exploration driven by the popularity of scuba diving. The disagreement about the Bimini Road has never been resolved to the satisfaction of both sides, and it probably never will be, because the question of what it is depends partly on evidence and partly on prior commitment to a conclusion, and the prior commitments in this debate are unusually strong. What is genuinely interesting about Casey's Atlantis, beyond the specific claims about crystals and catastrophes, is what it reveals about what different generations have needed from the myth. Donnelly's Atlantis was a Victorian Atlantis, a civilization of practical achievements, of agriculture and metallurgy and seafaring, whose legacy was the material progress of human civilization. Casey's Atlantis was a mid-20th century Atlantis, shaped by the anxieties of an age that had just watched technology produce the atomic bomb and was beginning to wonder whether human beings could be trusted with the powers they were developing. The Atlanteans, in Casey's telling, had faced exactly that question and had answered it badly, had let their spiritual development fall behind their technological development, and had been destroyed by the resulting imbalance. It was a myth for the nuclear age, and it resonated with people who were living through the nuclear age in ways that Plato's original philosophical parable could not quite reach. The details were invented, the crystal and the catastrophes and the past lives. But the anxiety underneath them was real, and the myth served it. The man who brought the Atlantis search into the modern era of serious underwater archaeology, who stripped away the crystals and the past lives and the mystical elaborations and attempted to conduct a genuinely rigorous investigation using the best available scientific methods, was a French researcher named Jacques Colina Girard, a geologist at the University of the Mediterranean who in 2001 published a paper in the journal Compte Rendu de l'Académie des Sciences proposing a specific and testable hypothesis about the origin of the Atlantis story. Colina Girard's argument was geological and precise. He pointed to a submerged landmass called the Spartel Bank, located in the Strait of Gibraltar at the entrance to the Atlantic, which had been above water at the end of the last ice age and had been submerged by rising sea levels approximately 11,000 years ago. The Spartel Bank is not large, nothing like continent-sized, but it sits exactly at the Pillars of Heracles, exactly where Plato said Atlantis was located, and its submergence would have been witnessed by human populations living in the region and would have entered the oral traditions of those populations as a memory of land lost to the sea. Colina Girard's hypothesis was received with considerably more respect than most Atlantis theories because it was based on real geology, made predictions that could be tested, and did not require Plato's account to be taken literally in its details. It proposed not that Atlantis was a continent or a great civilization, but that it was a memory, that the core of Plato's story, a landmass in the Strait of Gibraltar that was swallowed by the sea in a catastrophic event, was a genuine oral tradition going back 11,000 years, elaborated and distorted by millennia of retelling but anchored in a real geological event. Subsequent geological investigation of the Spartel Bank has confirmed that it was indeed above water during the late Ice Age and was gradually submerged as sea levels rose. Whether its submergence was dramatic enough to be experienced as a sudden catastrophe, and whether any population was living on it at the time that might have preserved a memory of its loss, remains uncertain. But the hypothesis is the most scientifically credible version of the Atlantis as real event argument that has been produced, and it deserves to be part of any serious conversation about what the story might be pointing at. And then there are the people who have gone looking not with theories or hypotheses, but with ships and sonar and the specific, expensive, logistically complicated work of deep ocean exploration. Robert Sarmast was an American researcher who spent years arguing that Atlantis was located in the eastern Mediterranean, specifically in the deep water between Cyprus and Syria, where the seafloor topography shows a submerged plateau that Sarmast argued matched Plato's description of the Atlantean plain in its dimensions and orientation. He mounted expeditions, used sonar equipment to map the seafloor, and in 2004 announced that he had found structures consistent with man-made walls and roads at a depth of approximately 1,500 meters. The announcement generated enormous media attention and was subsequently examined by other researchers who concluded that the features Sarmast had identified were natural geological formations rather than artificial structures. Sarmast disputed this conclusion. The dispute was never fully resolved, and the Eastern Mediterranean hypothesis faded from serious discussion without being definitively disproven, which is the fate of most specific Atlantis claims, neither confirmed nor entirely eliminated, just left hanging in the particular limbo that the subject seems to generate with depressing consistency. What connects all of these men, from Donnelly to Casey to Colina Girard to Sarmast, is not that they were all wrong. Some of them were considerably more right than others, and several of them asked questions that mainstream archaeology has not fully answered. What connects them is the specific quality of the obsession that the Atlantis question generates, the feeling that the answer is almost within reach, that one more piece of evidence will resolve the ambiguity, that the story is too specific and too persistent to be entirely without foundation. That feeling is not irrational. It is, in fact, a reasonable response to a genuine mystery. The problem is that it is also the feeling that keeps people searching long past the point where the evidence is actually pointing them anywhere useful, that it generates the kind of motivated reasoning that makes natural beach rock look like Atlantean roads and sonar reflections look like ancient walls. The obsession is the engine of the search, but it is also its greatest liability. And the history of the men who went looking for Atlantis is, among other things, a history of what happens when genuine curiosity and genuine intelligence are unable to make peace with the possibility that the answer may simply be out of reach. That is not a comfortable conclusion. But the Atlantis story has never been comfortable, and the men who went looking for it, whatever their specific failures, were asking a question that deserves to be asked, and were refusing to accept the easy dismissal that says the question is not worth asking at all. In that refusal, whatever its costs, there is something recognizable and something worth respecting, even when the specific answers they arrived at were wrong. The search continues. It always continues. And as we will see in the next chapter, the questions these men were asking have recently found some unexpected and genuinely unsettling new evidence that neither the believers nor the skeptics have entirely figured out what to do with. Chapter 3: The Connections That Won't Die. There is a specific kind of intellectual discomfort that serious archaeologists and historians experience when they encounter certain patterns in the ancient record, patterns that their training and their methodology tell them should not be there, that their commitment to rigorous evidence-based reasoning prevents them from explaining away easily, and that their professional instinct for caution prevents them from embracing too enthusiastically. It is the discomfort of a person who has found something that does not fit the neat story they have been telling, who cannot quite bring themselves to throw it away, but cannot quite figure out where it belongs. This discomfort is not the same thing as the excitement of the conspiracy theorist, who finds the same patterns and immediately concludes that everything they suspected was true. It is quieter than that, and more honest, and considerably more interesting, because it is the discomfort of someone who is actually trying to understand something rather than confirm something they already believe. Tonight, we are going to sit with that discomfort for a while and look at the patterns that generate it and try to understand what they might and might not mean. The first and most discussed of these patterns is the one that Donnelly made famous and that has been argued about ever since: the apparent parallels between the civilizations on opposite sides of the Atlantic, the pyramid builders of Egypt and the pyramid builders of Mesoamerica, the flood myths of the ancient Near East and the flood myths of indigenous peoples in the Americas, in Australia, in Southeast Asia, in virtually every part of the inhabited world, the solar worship that appears independently in ancient Egypt and ancient Peru, the practice of mummification that shows up in ancient Egypt and among certain cultures of the Canary Islands and in pre-Columbian South America, the remarkably similar mathematical and astronomical knowledge that appears in cultures separated by vast distances and apparently without contact. Donnelly looked at these parallels and concluded that they were evidence of a common origin, a lost civilization from which all of them descended. Mainstream archaeology looked at the same parallels and concluded that they were evidence of the independent inventive capacity of the human mind, that similar problems generate similar solutions, and that the appearance of parallels across cultures does not require a shared origin to explain it. Both positions contain truth, and the interesting question is not which one is entirely right, but where exactly the line falls between genuine independent invention and genuine cultural contact, because that line is considerably less clear than either side of the debate usually acknowledges. The pyramid argument is the weakest version of the parallels case, because the logic of pyramid construction is genuinely derivable from first principles, and the Egyptian pyramids and the Mesoamerican pyramids are actually quite different in their construction techniques and their purposes in ways that matter more than the superficial similarity of their shape. But the flood myth argument is considerably stronger, and it deserves more careful treatment than it usually receives from either side. The sheer ubiquity of flood myths across human cultures is a real phenomenon that requires explanation. There are flood myths in Mesopotamia, in the Hebrew Bible, in ancient Greek tradition, in Hindu scripture, in Chinese mythology, in the oral traditions of indigenous peoples in North America, South America, Australia, the Pacific Islands, and Sub-Saharan Africa. They are not all identical, they differ significantly in their details and their moral frameworks, but they share a core narrative structure, a great flood that destroys most of humanity, with a small group of survivors who preserve the seed of civilization. That core narrative appears in too many independent cultures to be explained entirely by diffusion from a single source, but it also appears in too many cultures with too much structural similarity to be entirely the product of independent invention. The most compelling explanation, and the one that serious researchers in several fields have been converging on in recent decades, is that the flood myths are memories. Not memories of a single flood, but memories of a specific geological period, the period between roughly 12,000 and 7,000 years ago, during which global sea levels rose dramatically as the great ice sheets of the last glacial maximum melted. During this period, sea levels rose by approximately 120 meters, flooding enormous areas of coastal and low-lying terrain around the world. The coastlines of the continents shifted significantly, swallowing vast areas of previously inhabited land. Human populations living in coastal areas, which is where humans have preferentially settled throughout prehistory because coastlines offer the richest and most diverse food sources, would have experienced this sea level rise as a series of catastrophic floods, some gradual and some rapid depending on local geography and the specific dynamics of ice sheet collapse. These experiences would have been encoded in the oral traditions of the affected populations and passed down through generations, changing and elaborating as stories do over thousands of years, but retaining the core memory of a time when the sea rose and swallowed the world. The flood myths are not all about Atlantis, but they may all be drawing from the same underlying geological reality, and that geological reality is the context in which the Atlantis story, if it has any real-world anchor at all, must be understood. The astronomical parallels are harder to explain and have received less mainstream attention, partly because they are more technical and partly because their implications are more uncomfortable. The ancient Egyptians had a sophisticated astronomical knowledge that allowed them to align their major monuments with remarkable precision to specific stellar positions and solar events. The builders of Stonehenge in Britain had a similarly sophisticated astronomical knowledge, evident in the careful alignment of the monument's major stones with the summer solstice sunrise and the winter solstice sunset. The Maya of Mesoamerica had an astronomical tradition of extraordinary sophistication, their calendar system encoding cycles of planetary motion with a precision that modern astronomers find impressive. The builders of the megalithic monuments of Göbekli Tepe in what is now Turkey who were constructing large architecturally sophisticated ritual structures at a date that pushes back to approximately 11,500 years ago, showed in their carved reliefs an apparent awareness of stellar positions and astronomical cycles that their supposed technological level should not have accommodated. None of these astronomical traditions are identical, and none of them require a common origin to explain, because humans everywhere look at the same sky and the same astronomical patterns are available to any careful observer anywhere on Earth. But the sophistication of astronomical knowledge in the ancient world and its apparent presence in cultures at much earlier periods than traditional archaeological timelines have allowed for is one of the genuinely puzzling features of the ancient record. Göbekli Tepe deserves particular attention in any serious discussion of what might underlie the Atlantis story, because it has done more than any other archaeological discovery of the past several decades to complicate the standard narrative of human prehistory in ways that have not yet been fully absorbed by mainstream archaeology. The site was excavated beginning in 1994 by the German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt, who spent the rest of his career working on it until his death in 2014. And what he found was so unexpected and so difficult to integrate into existing frameworks that the archaeological community is still arguing about its implications. Göbekli Tepe is a complex of large circular enclosures built from massive T-shaped limestone pillars, some of them weighing up to 20 tons, elaborately carved with representations of animals and abstract symbols, and arranged in configurations that appear to have astronomical significance. The site is located in southeastern Turkey in the foothills of the Taurus Mountains, and it has been dated by multiple methods to approximately 11,500 years ago, which places its construction firmly in the period that archaeologists call the pre-pottery Neolithic, a period when human beings were, according to the standard narrative, living in small mobile hunter-gatherer groups without the social organization, the labor surplus, or the architectural knowledge required to construct a monument of this scale and sophistication. The implications of Göbekli Tepe for the standard narrative of human prehistory are significant and have not been fully worked out. The construction of the site required not just the quarrying and transport and erection of massive stone pillars, but the social organization to coordinate the labor of large numbers of people over extended periods of time, the architectural knowledge to design and build stable large-scale stone structures, and the symbolic and possibly astronomical knowledge evident in the carvings and orientations of the enclosures. All of this is supposed to have developed much later in the context of settled agricultural societies with surplus food production and the complex social hierarchies that surplus enables. But Göbekli Tepe was built before agriculture, or at least before the development of agriculture in this region, which means that either the standard narrative of how social complexity develops is wrong, or the people who built Göbekli Tepe had access to knowledge and social organization that we have not previously attributed to hunter-gatherers of this period, or some third option that we have not yet thought of. The site does not prove the existence of Atlantis, but it proves that human beings were doing things 11,000 years ago that our standard frameworks say they should not have been doing. And that proof requires the standard frameworks to be revised in ways that have not yet been fully accomplished. The deepest and most genuinely uncomfortable parallel is the one that connects Plato's account to what we now know about the actual geology and oceanography of the late Ice Age world. Plato says that Atlantis was destroyed approximately 9,000 years before his time, which places the destruction at approximately 9600 BCE by modern reckoning. He says it was destroyed by earthquakes and floods. He says it sank beneath the sea. He says the region where it sank became impassable, full of shoals and shallow water that prevented navigation. Every one of these specific details is consistent with what we now know about the behavior of sea levels and coastlines during the period of rapid glacial melting that occurred between approximately 12,000 and 7,000 years ago. The dates are approximately right. The mechanism is approximately right. The consequence, shallow, impassable water where navigable sea had been, is approximately right. This convergence is either a remarkable coincidence or it is evidence that Plato's account, however elaborated and distorted by myth and philosophy, contains a core of genuine historical memory that accurately describes in mythological terms the geological reality of a specific period of Earth history. The convergence does not prove that Plato was describing a real civilization. It does not prove that there was an Atlantis in the sense of a specific, locatable, archaeologically recoverable urban culture. But it suggests, more strongly than most Atlantis researchers have been willing to state directly, that the story is not pure invention, that somewhere in its ancestry, however many generations of retelling and elaboration and philosophical reworking separate it from its origin, there is a memory of a world that was lost beneath the rising sea at the end of the Ice Age, preserved in oral tradition for thousands of years before Plato encountered some version of it and turned it into the philosophical parable we know. The memory is distorted beyond recognition in its specific details, but the underlying reality it is pointing at is real, it is geological, it is documented, and it happened in approximately the time and manner that Plato's story, stripped of its mythological elaborations, describes. There is one more connection that deserves attention before we move on, one that is less often discussed than the pyramids and the flood myths, but that is, in some ways, the most specific and the most difficult to explain away. It concerns the oral traditions of indigenous peoples around the world who describe, in terms that are sometimes remarkably specific, memories of land that was lost to the sea. The Aboriginal Australians of the coastal regions have oral traditions describing the drowning of coastal lands that their ancestors inhabited, traditions that have recently been shown by researchers to correspond with considerable accuracy to the actual pattern of sea level rise along the Australian coast during the late Ice Age. The traditions describe specific geographical features, rivers and bays and offshore islands that no longer exist above water but whose existence has been confirmed by underwater surveys of the continental shelf. The researchers who published this work in 2017 argued that the Australian Aboriginal oral traditions preserve genuine memories of events that occurred between approximately 7,000 and 12,000 years ago, making them the oldest accurate geographical memories yet documented in any human cultural tradition. If Aboriginal Australians have preserved accurate memories of coastal flooding events for 7,000 to 12,000 years, then the possibility that ancient Mediterranean cultures preserved memories of similar events for similar or shorter periods is not only plausible but almost certain. The specific traditions may be different, the mythological frameworks they are embedded in are certainly different, but the underlying capacity for long-term preservation of geographical and environmental memory in oral tradition has been demonstrated to exist, and that demonstration changes the terms of the Atlantis debate in a way that has not yet been fully appreciated. The The question is no longer whether ancient oral traditions can preserve accurate memories of geological events over thousands of years. We know they can. The question is whether the specific tradition that Plato received from Egyptian sources was one of them. That question remains open, but it is now a considerably more serious question than it was before the Australian research was published, and it deserves to be treated as such. The connections that won't die are not proof of Atlantis. Let that be clear, because clarity is important in a subject where the line between evidence and wishful thinking is so easily crossed. They are not proof of a specific lost civilization in the Atlantic or anywhere else. They are not confirmation of Plato's specific account or of any of the specific theories about where Atlantis might have been. What they are is a body of converging evidence that the late Ice Age world contained human populations living in areas that are now underwater, that those populations experienced the flooding of their coastlines as catastrophic events that entered their cultural memory, and that those memories persisted in oral tradition for thousands of years before being written down in forms that are now available to us. That is not Atlantis in the Hollywood sense, but it is something real and something important, and it is something that the reflexive dismissal of the entire Atlantis question tends to throw out, along with the crystals and the aliens and the ancient nuclear weapons. The connections are real even when the specific theories built on them are not, and sitting with the connections, taking them seriously without jumping to the conclusions that the Donnellys and Caseys of the world have jumped to, is the beginning of a genuinely honest engagement with what the Atlantis story might be trying to tell us. What it might be trying to tell us is the subject of our final chapter, and it is, I think, more interesting than either the true believers or the dismissive skeptics have yet managed to articulate. Chapter 4. What if it was real? Let us begin with a thought experiment, not the dramatic kind, not the version where we imagine golden temples rising from the Atlantic and Atlantean kings sacrificing bulls to Poseidon in the flickering torchlight of their orichalcum-plated temple, the sober kind, the kind that requires us to set aside everything we think we know about what the ancient world looked like and ask a simpler and more uncomfortable question. What if there were sophisticated human communities, not necessarily civilizations in the full sense of the word, but communities with accumulated knowledge, with navigational ability, with architectural capacity, with astronomical awareness, living in coastal areas of the world during the late Ice Age that are now underwater? And what if those communities were destroyed by the rapid sea level rise that followed the end of the last glacial maximum? And what if the memory of their destruction persisted in oral tradition for thousands of years before being written down in the forms we now have access to? What would that mean? What would it change? And why does mainstream archaeology find that question so much more difficult to engage with than its surface simplicity suggests? The answer to the last question first. Mainstream archaeology finds the question difficult, not because the evidence against it is overwhelming, though in some specific forms the evidence is clear enough, but because the question itself sits in uncomfortable proximity to a long and embarrassing history of pseudo-archaeological claims that have used the idea of a lost advanced civilization to serve agendas that had nothing to do with genuine historical inquiry. The 19th century saw the idea of a sophisticated antediluvian civilization deployed in support of racial theories that used supposed Atlantean ancestry to explain the achievements of non-European cultures while denying those cultures independent credit for their own accomplishments. The 20th century saw the same idea absorbed into New Age mysticism and conspiracy theory, decoupled from any serious evidentiary standards and used to sell books and documentaries and retreat weekends to people whose appetite for wonder was greater than their appetite for rigor. The professional archaeologist who takes the lost civilization question seriously risks being associated with this lineage, risks being confused with the ancient aliens crowd, risks having their career damaged by proximity to a subject that their colleagues have learned to treat as a marker of intellectual unseriousness. That risk is real, and it has a chilling effect on research, causing serious people to be considerably more dismissive of serious questions than the evidence alone would warrant. But the evidence alone is what we are interested in tonight, and the evidence alone, stripped of the mystical elaborations and the racial theories and the crystal-powered energy systems, presents a picture that is genuinely interesting and genuinely unresolved. Let us look at it carefully. We know from geology and oceanography and the physical record of the sea floor that between approximately 20,000 and 7,000 years ago, global sea levels rose by approximately 120 meters. We know that this rise was not uniform or gradual, but occurred in episodes, with periods of rapid rise separated by periods of relative stability, and that some of these episodes of rapid rise were fast enough by geological standards to have been experienced as catastrophic by human populations living in the affected coastal zones. We know that the continental shelves of the world's continents, which are now submerged under shallow seas, were exposed as dry land during the period of maximum glaciation and provided enormous areas of potentially habitable terrain that was in many cases more climatically favorable than the continental interiors, because coastal areas benefit from the moderating influence of the ocean on temperature and the abundant food resources of the marine environment. We know that human populations have preferentially settled in coastal areas throughout the period of modern human existence, and that the continental shelves that were exposed during the Ice Age were almost certainly inhabited by human populations whose settlements are now submerged underwater that may be anywhere from a few meters to over 100 meters deep. What we do not know, and what the archaeological record has been extremely slow to reveal because underwater archaeology is expensive and technically demanding and has historically been a low priority for funding bodies, is the nature and sophistication of those submerged coastal communities. The standard narrative of human prehistory, the narrative that runs from small mobile hunter-gatherer bands to settled agricultural villages to complex urban civilizations in a broadly linear progression over the past 12,000 years, was constructed almost entirely from the evidence of inland and upland sites that happen to survive above the rising sea levels. The coastal sites, which may have contained some of the most densely populated and culturally sophisticated communities of the late Ice Age, are mostly underwater, and their absence from the archaeological record has created a systematic bias in our understanding of what human life looked like before the development of agriculture. We have been reconstructing human prehistory from a sample that is missing its coastal component, which is like trying to reconstruct the history of a civilization from the records of its rural provinces, while its coastal cities lie inaccessible at the bottom of the sea. The implications of this systematic bias for the Atlantis question are significant if we have been systematically underestimating the sophistication of late Ice Age coastal communities because the physical evidence of those communities is underwater, then the possibility that some of those communities had developed levels of social organization architectural knowledge, and accumulated cultural wisdom that exceeded what we have attributed to hunter-gatherers of the period is not as implausible as it sounds when measured against the impoverished sample of the inland archaeological record. The people who built Göbekli Tepe 11,500 years ago were not, as we noted in the previous chapter, the simple mobile hunter-gatherers that the standard narrative would predict for that period and location. They were people with sophisticated social organization, symbolic knowledge, and architectural capacity. Where did that sophistication come from? The standard answer is that it developed locally in the specific context of the Fertile Crescent region, driven by the particular ecological and climatic conditions of the late Ice Age in that area. That answer may be correct, but it is also possible that some of it came from elsewhere, that the people of the inland sites were beneficiaries of knowledge and cultural traditions that had originated in now submerged coastal communities and had been carried inland by populations displaced by rising sea levels. The possibility cannot be ruled out, and the evidence from sites like Göbekli Tepe suggests it deserves more serious consideration than it has generally received. The researcher who has made this argument most carefully and most influentially in recent years is not an archaeologist but a journalist and popular writer named Graham Hancock, whose book Fingerprints of the Gods, published in 1995, and its subsequent companion volumes have sold millions of copies and generated a level of popular interest in the question of lost Ice Age civilizations that has far outpaced the academic response. Hancock is a controversial figure whose work mainstream archaeologists tend to dismiss with considerable impatience. And some of that dismissal is warranted because Hancock has a tendency to present speculative connections as established facts, to underweight contrary evidence, and to frame his argument in ways that imply a systematic suppression of inconvenient truths by the archaeological establishment that is not supported by the evidence of how archaeology actually functions as a discipline. These are real weaknesses in his work, and they deserve to be acknowledged. But Hancock has also done something that the dismissal of his work tends to obscure, which is to identify a genuine gap in the standard narrative, the systematic absence of the submerged coastal record, and to ask what filling that gap might do to our understanding of human prehistory. That question is legitimate regardless of the specific answers Hancock proposes and the fact that it has been taken up by serious researchers in geology, oceanography, and archaeology. Researchers who do not share Hancock's stylistic tendency toward dramatic revelation, but who have followed the evidence he pointed toward into peer-reviewed publications and academic conferences, suggest that the question itself was worth asking even when the specific answers were wrong. The gap is real, the bias is real, and filling it, as underwater archaeology slowly and expensively begins to do, is going to change our picture of human prehistory in ways that we cannot fully predict from where we currently stand. The specific discovery that has done the most to shift the terms of this debate in the past decade, more than any argument or any book, is not the Gulf of Khambhat site in India, which remains disputed, or the Bimini Road, which has been convincingly explained as a natural formation. It is a discovery made not by Atlantis researchers but by mainstream geologists and oceanographers studying the history of the North Sea, the body of water that now separates Britain from continental Europe. During the last glacial maximum, the North Sea was dry land, a vast plain of tundra and grassland that connected Britain to the European continent and provided habitat for woolly mammoths and rhinoceroses and the human hunters who pursued them. This plain, which has been given the name Doggerland by the researchers who study it, was gradually flooded by rising sea levels between approximately 12,000 and 7,000 years ago, with a possible final catastrophic inundation triggered by a massive submarine landslide off the coast of Norway, known as the Storegga Slide, that occurred approximately 8,150 years ago and generated a tsunami that would have swept across the remaining low-lying areas of Doggerland with devastating effect. The research on Doggerland has been conducted by mainstream geologists and archaeologists using entirely conventional methods: sonar mapping, sediment coring, analysis of artifacts dredged up by fishing nets, and it has revealed a picture of a densely inhabited and culturally sophisticated landscape that was swallowed by the sea over the course of several thousand years. The people of Doggerland were Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, not civilized in the urban sense, but they were people with accumulated knowledge of their landscape, with social structures capable of maintaining oral traditions over many generations, and with the experience of watching their world slowly and then suddenly disappear beneath the rising sea. If any human population had reason to develop and preserve a cultural memory of catastrophic coastal flooding, it was them. And if that memory traveled, carried by the refugees of Doggerland into the settled communities of Britain and continental Europe, it could have been absorbed into the oral traditions of those communities and preserved for thousands of years. The flood myths of northern European cultures may be Doggerland memories, the specific imagery of a land lost beneath the sea that appears in so many ancient traditions may be, in part, a Doggerland echo. And if Doggerland is real, if the memory of its flooding persisted in oral tradition for thousands of years, then the general principle that Plato's Atlantis story rests on, the preservation of a genuine geographical memory of a real flooding event in ancient oral tradition, is not merely possible but demonstrated. This is the version of the Atlantis question that deserves to be taken seriously, and it is considerably different from the version that most people encounter when they search for Atlantis online or turn on a documentary. It does not involve golden temples or divine bloodlines or mysterious metals or alien technology. It involves the systematic reconstruction of a human past that has been partially hidden from us by the accident of sea level rise, the recognition that our sample of the ancient record is biased toward inland and upland sites in ways that have led us to underestimate the sophistication and the cultural richness of coastal communities that are now underwater, and the possibility that some of the most persistent and widely distributed myths in human culture are not philosophical allegories or theological constructions, but geographical memories, echoes of a world that is still there, still mappable, still recoverable in principle by the tools of modern underwater archaeology. What would it actually mean if future underwater archaeology confirmed the existence of sophisticated human communities in the submerged continental shelves of the world, communities that had developed significant levels of social organization and accumulated knowledge before being displaced by rising sea levels? It would not mean that Atlantis existed in Plato's specific sense, with its concentric canals and its orichalcum walls and its 10 kings descended from Poseidon. It would not vindicate the crystal enthusiasts or the ancient astronaut theorists or any of the specific elaborations that the Atlantis myth has accumulated over the centuries. But it would mean that the standard narrative of human prehistory needs to be revised, that the timeline of social complexity needs to be pushed back, that the origins of the accumulated knowledge that appears in the earliest written civilizations need to be reconsidered in light of a much richer and more complex prehistoric world than our current sample of the archaeological record has allowed us to see. It would mean that the story of human civilization begins earlier and in more places than we thought, and that much of it is still underwater. That revision is already beginning. It is happening slowly and carefully and without the dramatic revelations that Hancock and his predecessors have promised, because that is how real scientific knowledge actually advances, through the accumulation of careful evidence rather than through the sudden disclosure of hidden truths. The underwater archaeology of the continental shelves is still in its infancy, limited by the expense and difficulty of working in deep water over large areas, but the technology is improving and the funding is gradually increasing as the significance of the submerged landscape becomes more widely appreciated. The next few decades of underwater archaeological research may change our understanding of human prehistory more dramatically than any comparable period since the discovery of Neanderthals, and some of what they reveal will almost certainly bear on the questions that the Atlantis story has been asking for 2,500 years. The honest answer to the question, what if it was real, is therefore this: something was real. Not Atlantis in Plato's specific sense, almost certainly not, but the world that the Atlantis story is pointing at, however imperfectly and mythologically, and through how many layers of distortion, was real. The late Ice Age world contained sophisticated human communities in coastal areas that are now underwater. Those communities were displaced and in some cases destroyed by rapid sea level rise. The memory of that displacement persisted in oral tradition for thousands of years and left its traces in the flood myths and the lost paradise stories and the persistent sense that something was once possessed and then lost, that appears in the cultural memory of virtually every human civilization. Plato received some version of that memory, filtered through Egyptian oral tradition and his own philosophical concerns, and turned it into the story we know. The details are wrong. The philosophy is Plato's own, but the memory underneath the story is real, and it is old, and it is waiting to be fully recovered by the archaeology of the seafloor. That is not the Atlantis of Hollywood or the History Channel. It is something quieter and stranger and more genuinely wonderful, the possibility that embedded in one of the most persistent myths in human culture is an accurate, if deeply distorted, memory of a world that existed before history, as we understand it, a world that the sea took away and that we are only now, with sonar and remotely operated vehicles and the accumulated tools of modern oceanography, beginning to see again. The mystery has not been solved. It has been deepened, refined, made more specific and more tractable than it was before. And that deepening, that refinement, is not the end of the Atlantis story. It is, in a very real sense, its beginning. So here we are again, at the end of a journey that has taken us considerably further than most Atlantis discussions are willing to go. We began with the real candidates, the specific places and geological events that serious researchers have proposed as the anchor points of Plato's story, from the devastated caldera of Santorini to the submerged marshes of southern Spain, to the haunting sonar images from the floor of the Gulf of Combat. We spent time with the men who went looking, from the magnificent and magnificently wrong Ignatius Donnelly, to the sleeping prophet Edgar Cayce, to the geologist Colina Girard, with his carefully argued hypothesis about the Spartel Bank, and we tried to understand what their obsession revealed about both the power of the question and its dangers. We examined the connections that won't die, the flood myths and the astronomical parallels and the extraordinary Aboriginal Australian oral traditions and the uncomfortable implications of Göbekli Tepe for everything we thought we knew about the timeline of human sophistication. And we ended where the most serious version of the question has to end, with the submerged continental shelves and the systematic bias in our archaeological record, and the slowly growing recognition that the standard narrative of human prehistory is missing its coastal chapter, that the chapter is underwater, and that recovering it may change everything. None of this proves Atlantis. That bears repeating because the history of this subject is littered with the wreckage of claims made with more confidence than the evidence warranted, and adding to that wreckage would be a disservice to the genuine mystery underneath the mythology. The golden temples are Plato's invention. The orichalcum is Plato's invention. The 10 kings descended from Poseidon are Plato's invention. The specific location, the specific chronology, the specific details of the cataclysm as described in Timaeus and Critias, none of these are recoverable as historical fact because they were never historical fact in the first place. They were philosophy, dressed in the clothes of history, using the ancient technique of making a lesson more vivid by giving it a setting and a story. But the lesson itself and the memory underneath the lesson, those are not inventions. The lesson that sophisticated civilizations are fragile, that prosperity corrupts, that the sea can swallow in a night what generations have built, is as true today as it was when Plato wrote it. And the memory, the deep cultural memory of a world lost beneath the rising sea, encoded in the flood myths of every civilization and the oral traditions of coastal peoples on every continent and the submerged archaeology of the continental shelves. That memory is real. It is pointing at something that actually happened, something whose full dimensions we are only beginning to understand, something that our growing capacity for underwater exploration is slowly and carefully bringing back into the light. That is, in the end, what makes the Atlantis story worth taking seriously after 2,500 years. Not because it is literally true, not because there is a city of gold on the Atlantic sea floor waiting to be found by the right expedition with the right sonar equipment, but because it is the oldest and most persistent version of a genuine human memory, and because that memory, properly understood, is trying to tell us something about who we are and where we came from that our standard histories have not yet fully accommodated. We are a species with a past that extends further and reaches deeper than we have generally been willing to acknowledge. Some of that past is underwater. Some of it is still recoverable, and the act of recovering it, slow and expensive and methodologically demanding as it is one of the most important things we can be doing as a civilization that is itself in its own way confronting the question of what happens when the sea begins to rise. There is a specific kind of comfort that comes from sitting with an unsolved mystery long enough to understand its shape, to know what it is asking even if you cannot yet answer it, to feel the weight of the question without being overwhelmed by the absence of the answer. The Atlantis story offers that comfort if you approach it correctly, with enough skepticism to resist the easy answers and enough openness to resist the easy dismissals. The mystery is real. The questions it asks are real. The memory underneath the myth is real, and the fact that it has persisted for 2,500 years, surviving every attempt to solve it and every attempt to dismiss it, accumulating new layers of meaning with each generation that wrestles with it, suggests that it will still be with us long after the current generation of underwater archaeologists has done its work, long after the current debates about specific sites and specific dating have been resolved or abandoned, long after the tools we are currently using to probe the seafloor have been replaced by tools we cannot yet imagine. The sea keeps its secrets patiently. It has been keeping the secrets of the late Ice Age world for 7 to 12,000 years, and it will keep them until we are ready to receive them carefully enough to understand what they mean. Tonight, lying in whatever room you are in, with whatever soft light is still on, you are as close to those secrets as any generation has ever been, not because the answer is near, but because the question finally is being asked in the right way, with the right tools, and with the right combination of wonder and rigor that a mystery of this age and this depth deserves. Let that be enough for tonight. Let the sea hold its secrets a little longer. Let the submerged cities, if they are there, rest quietly on the continental shelves in the dark, cold water, patient as they have always been, waiting for the sonar and the remotely operated vehicles and the careful hands of underwater archaeologists who have not yet been born. Let Plato's golden temples dissolve back into the philosophy they always were. Let the flood myths of every civilization settle into the deep memory they carry without demanding that they be decoded tonight. And let yourself drift slowly into the particular darkness that exists on the other side of sleep, where the questions that have no answers yet become the most beautiful questions of all, and where the lost world that every human culture has carried in its memory since the ice began to melt is not a mystery to be solved, but a dream to be gently, carefully, gratefully inhabited. The sea is not rising tonight. The ground beneath you is not shaking. Whatever was lost 12,000 years ago is still lost, and whatever will be found is still waiting to be found, and none of that requires anything of you right now except the willingness to rest. The story has been told, the question has been asked, the mystery is intact, and you are warm and still in a world that, for all its fragility, is still here, still holding, still carrying forward the long, improbable project of human civilization that began, perhaps, on a coastline that no longer exists, in a world that the sea took away, in a time so far back that the only thing left of it is the faintest echo in the oldest stories we know how to tell. That echo is Atlantis. That echo is real, and tonight it is yours. Good night.